I still can't believe that 007 Nightfire ended up on the GBA. And this isn't some egregiously scaled back imitation of Nightfire either. This is full-on Nightfire. 007 Nightfire is a full-blown 3D first-person shooter with complex multi-level geometry, a heaping portion of weapons and gadgets, and even a good variety of mission types and set pieces, whether it be bombastic shooting segments against a helicopter, stealthy infiltration missions, or even an anti-gravity space level. The developer really committed to making this feel like a genuine Bond adventure, and they pulled it off admirably. The graphics here are some of the most impressive on the GBA. Most other GBA shooters feature mostly flat level design, but Nightfire opts for multi-story levels, forcing you to aim up and down to the floors above and below you, which does a lot to make it feel like a modern console shooter, as opposed to something like Doom, which is mostly flat. There are also some incredibly cool lighting touches, like these moving spotlights, or how your muzzle flashes light up the environment. The gadgets also go a long way to making this feel more in-depth than your typical GBA shooter. There's a grappling hook, a laser watch, and a couple other trinkets here and there. The grappling hook in particular is a very cool inclusion, but unfortunately, it's a bit underutilized. The anti-gravity levels, though, are extremely cool, and there are a couple of them. Here, you'll be flying through space, really taking advantage of the vertical dimension, shooting enemies above and below you who are moving around freely. It's a level of ambition and uniqueness that just isn't present in similar GBA outings. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows here, though. While the graphics are undoubtedly impressive, the textures can look kinda muddy. Some of them also look unfinished, like this bright green ceiling or this plain red banister. Furthermore, nothing is explained to you very well, so figuring out how and when to use the various gadgets is a lot of trial and error. I ended up using a guide to get through the game. It's also not a terribly long game, but I do think it's fun enough to be worth a couple of playthroughs, especially since it's a lot more fun once you have a good sense of what you need to do. The frame rate isn't great either, but I got used to it after a while, and it's on par with some other ambitious 3D GBA games. On the whole, I loved my time with 007 Nightfire. The original is one of my favorite games on GameCube, and this is a remarkably impressive version of that game. 007 Nightfire is one of the must-play 3D games on the GBA, and despite its flaws, I highly recommend it. Backtrack has the distinct honor of being the first-person shooter on the GBA, and that is basically its one redeeming quality. The only nice thing I can say about Backtrack is that it paved the road for much better games. There are two fatal flaws with this one. First, the draw distance is one of the worst I've ever seen, which makes navigating its labyrinthine levels an absolute nightmare, because in order to make out any environmental details or landmarks, you have to be right on top of them. To make matters worse, the levels are enormous. Thankfully, there's a map, but it sucks to keep opening the map every 5 seconds to make sure you're going in the right direction. The other major problem is that bullets are far and few between, and once you run out, it's basically game over. You can try running past enemies, but often near the end of the level, the game will throw so many at you that it's impossible to dodge them all. Your knife works fine against a single enemy, but when there's a swarm, you might as well just start over. Unless you really want to check out the very first FPS on the GBA, stay well clear of Backtrack. Dark Arena on the GBA is a surprisingly great Doom clone. While nowhere near as polished, and lacking the attention to detail of that historic game, Dark Arena is a fun and worthwhile shooter. The levels are all well designed, with some large open combat areas as well as tighter linear corridors. The guns are all fun to use, especially the starting quick-firing pistol, and it's a meaty adventure with 20-odd levels. The environments aren't nearly as detailed as those found in Doom, with most walls being a single flat, low-detailed texture, which doesn't really give any of the levels a sense of consistency or place. It's all mostly just brick walls and brown floors. The trade-off is that this lack of detail allows Dark Arena to run at a consistently smooth frame rate. I also found the lack of a crosshair made it rather frustrating to aim well, but otherwise Dark Arena is actually one of the better controlling first-person shooters on the system. Dark Arena isn't at the very top of my list for best first-person shooters on the GBA, but it's better than a lot of them, and I'd say it's worth your time if you've already exhausted all of the best ones. It's Doom on the GBA. It's Doom 2 on the GBA, but seriously, both Doom and Doom 2 are extremely faithful ports. They both run as smooth as butter, and they look and play exactly how you'd expect. Doom on the GBA was actually the first time I had ever beaten Doom. I played it on PC a lot with my dad growing up, but I had never actually beaten the game before the GBA version. Having Doom on the go was a revelation for me as a kid. I played it constantly, and finally, after many attempts, I finally beat the final level. On the easiest difficulty, mind you, but I was a kid and it still felt like a big deal. Doom 2 is actually even more impressive. Doom 1 had some muddy textures, and it felt like it wasn't scaled quite perfectly for the system, but Doom 2, on the other hand, looks flawless. If you're looking for portable Doom, these are both still excellent options. They're as fun as they've ever been and are wonderful additions to the GBA library. Duke Nukem Advance isn't a port of Duke Nukem 3D, but instead it's a full-blown original Duke Nukem first-person shooter, built from the ground up for the GBA, and it's excellent. Most first-person shooters in the GBA keep things uncomplicated. Duke Nukem Advance goes for broke. You'll be jumping on boxes to reach keys, teleporting to other parts of the level, crawling through air ducts, hitting switches, shooting exploding barrels, engaging in some light platforming, hacking into security feeds, and even fighting in boss battles. These are all things you'd expect for a console FPS, but here on the GBA, they make this game feel so much bigger than it actually is. There are even little touches like being able to shoot out computer screens or shooting toilets, which causes water to spray everywhere. Environments are also detailed and complex. One level sees you navigating a subway, hopping between the train cars before entering the station and finally delving into an alien hive and battling a giant spider boss. There's a real sense of place for each level. The controls work great and the guns feel just like you remember them on the PC original. Enemies are simple sprites, which initially feels a bit jarring, but I grew used to it the more I played. Duke Nukem Advance is one of the most well-rounded and well-designed first-person shooters on the GBA, and you should absolutely check it out. X vs. Sever was the first-person shooter I owned for the Game Boy Advance. For that reason alone, it will always have a special place in my heart. There are actually two complete campaigns here, one where you play as X and the other, obviously, as Sever. They're very similar, but the level layouts are different, which makes them both worth playing. The gunplay is very satisfying, with a good variety of weapons like a sniper rifle, a minigun, and a grenade launcher being the standouts. Unfortunately, the levels themselves are fairly plain and uninteresting. You've got your typical office buildings, warehouses, and apartment complexes. The game does introduce some variety through a few thermal vision and sniper sequences, but mostly you'll be following a linear path to the end of the level. It's not a terribly long game either, but it can get rather challenging in the later stages. While X vs. Sever isn't in the running for best FPS on the GBA, it does everything well enough that it's a good bit of fun. X vs. Sever Ballistic is the sequel to the original X vs. Sever, obviously. Ballistic takes everything that game did and pushes it even further. Ballistic also introduces some NPCs to the world, which really surprised me. At first, I thought they were enemies until I realized that they never attacked, and they just ran away when I shot at them. The graphics engine has also been pushed much further here, with more detailed environments, more enemies on screen, and more complex geometry, all while continuing to run smoothly. The only real warning I can give about Ballistic is that the later levels are extremely difficult. I recommend save scumming if you're playing on an emulator, because this game is hard. Overall, X vs. Sever Ballistic is an improvement in nearly every way over its predecessor, and a great FPS on the GBA. Greg Hastings' Tournament Paintball on the GBA is the single worst first-person shooter that I have ever played. I don't know anything about paintball, but I imagine that it's a whole lot more fun than this. Each match takes place in a contained arena with some pillars to hide behind. First off, the game looks awful. The frame rate chugs and movement feels horribly stiff. If you and an enemy shoot each other at the same time, there's a minigame that pops up. At least I think that's what happens, since it's so hard to tell if you're being shot at or not, since a single hit loses the match. It's always 1 vs. 3, and I found the best strategy was to back up and lob paintballs from a distance. If I hadn't already committed to a 10-minute minimum for every 3D game on the GBA, I would have turned this off immediately. Greg Hastings' Tournament Paintball on the GBA can burn in hell. Ice 9 is one of the only made from the ground up for GBA first-person shooters, and it's also one of the best. Graphically, Ice 9 is the most impressive first-person shooter on the GBA, in my opinion. The geometry might be more complex in Nightfire, but Ice 9 runs better, is a smoother experience, and has less jagged edges. The gameplay is also a ton of fun, with a great control scheme, generous hitboxes for enemies, and unique mission requirements that kept the entire campaign engaging. It's also a very weird game. Of the 18 missions, the first 3 are elaborate training missions, which do not leave a good first impression. Right out of the gate, the game teaches you to learn the difference between enemies and NPCs. You're told to shoot all the enemy cutouts, but not the innocent bystander cutouts. Then, when you finally get past the opening training missions and onto the first mission, you're dropped into an office building with both enemy guards and NPCs NPC office workers. There's a gate that you can't access unless you've defeated all the enemies, so you'd obviously assume you have to take out all of the guards, but leave the office workers alone, right? Wrong. Not only do you have to shoot the guards that attack you, but you also have to chase down and assassinate all of the office workers. Sure, the game hand waves away the murder by saying you're shooting them with non-lethal bullets, but judging by the terror in their screams as they run away from you, and their expressive death animations, as well as the fact that you are wielding a submachine gun, I call bullshit. Later, you get a pair of night vision goggles, which adds a nice deal of strategy, as levels often have very bright areas as well as dark sections that require the night vision. To my surprise, you're also given a grenade launcher, which features some actual rudimentary physics, like bouncing grenades and enemy bodies flying across the screen. Some slower sniper sections break up the gunplay too. The only place that Ice 9 really falters is in its environmental locations. There are far too many office buildings, training grounds, and city streets. I wish we had gotten to see an Ice 9 2 that visited some more interesting locales. To make up for that lack of variety though, the environments feature a ton of destructible objects, which is a really nice touch, especially when a whole room explodes when you shoot a fire extinguisher. While it's not perfect, I loved Ice 9. If you're looking for a wholly unique GBA original first-person shooter, and you don't mind waiting through 15 minutes of training missions to get to the good stuff, I highly recommend you check out Ice 9. Iridion 3D was one of the launch titles for the GBA, and at the time, its faux 3D graphics were pretty insane. Granted, it's using full motion video loops to achieve its 3D effect, but it works well enough. It's unfortunate that the very first level is also the most impressive, since the following outdoor stages rely on either clouds or water to sell the effect, and it's far less impressive than the fully indoor environments of the opening level. Gameplay-wise, it's fine. Aiming is rather difficult given the perspective and the lack of a crosshair, and I feel like the hit detection is a bit too off, as sometimes enemies will bump into me and nothing will happen, and other times I'll swear I dodged that projectile, but I'll still blow up. There are only 7 levels too, which is a bummer. If you're interested in one of the earliest attempts at presenting 3D on the GBA, play the first level of Iridion. Otherwise, skip this one in favor of its much better sequel. While Iridion 3D was aiming for Star Fox, Iridion 2 is a more traditional shmup. Iridion 2 might not be as technically impressive as Iridion 3D, but it plays a million times better. This time, you have multiple different weapon types, and the new perspective makes aiming and dodging far more precise. The levels are colorful and varied too, as opposed to the palette-swapped ocean and sky settings from the previous game. Backgrounds still use the video loops, but they look nicer and are more detailed than the originals, even if they don't sell the 3D effect quite as dramatically given the new perspective. With twice the number of stages and much tighter gameplay, Iridion 2 might not be as technically impressive as the original, but it is a much better game than Iridion 3D. Kill.Switch is one of my favorite games on the Game Boy Advance, and one of the only games on this list that I saw all the way through to the end. Besides Driver 3, I can't think of any other third-person shooters on the GBA, which really sets Kill.Switch apart. The game looks incredible too, with fully 3D environments and character models, and a great variety of locations to explore. But it's the control scheme that really makes Kill.Switch feel unique. The D-pad is used to walk forward and backwards, or turn in place, sort of like Resident Evil's tank controls. L and R are used to strafe left and right, A shoots, and B enters cover. But if you hold down L and R, you're given full control over the crosshairs, allowing you to line up precise shots. It will definitely take some getting used to, but ultimately it gives you an enormous amount of freedom with such few buttons, and does a great job making Kill.Switch feel like a real deal console third-person cover shooter. Enemies are tough too, so you'll be spending a lot of time in cover. Levels run a bit long, and over time you'll start feeling like every room is just another shooting gallery, but it's still an enormously impressive game on the GBA. Kill.Switch is really unique and unlike any other shooter on the GBA. It's a ton of fun and features some of the most impressive graphics on the system. I really can't recommend this one highly enough. And now we've come to the very worst game on this list. Well, maybe second worst, behind that Paintball game. I tried so hard to push through Medal of Honor Underground. I really wanted to see this one all the way to the end, just so I could experience this trash fire in its entirety. But unfortunately, I just couldn't bring myself to inflict that much pain on myself. Everything you've ever heard about Medal of Honor on the Game Boy Advance is true, and yet playing it for yourself is worse than you could have ever prepared for. The 3D graphics are the trippiest, most headache-inducing thing I've ever seen. Wall textures scroll across the geometry as you move around the level for some godforsaken reason, making for a truly baffling visual glitch. Enemies are blue smears, some are even missing pixels, making them look like transparent blue phantoms instead of enemy soldiers. Your health bar is a baffling color wheel at the bottom of the screen that I just could never figure out. And even though a quarter of the screen is obscured by a banner featuring the title of the game, the engine still can't hold a decent frame rate. The list goes on. Honestly, Medal of Honor Underground is worth checking out, but don't play past the first level. It's worth seeing for yourself just how bad this game truly is. I'm glad I tried it, but this is one I will never touch again. Have you ever played a game with one glaring flaw? And had that flaw been ironed out, the game would have been amazing. And yet, that one flaw ruins the entire experience. Well, that's Serious Sam on the GBA in a nutshell. Serious Sam on the GBA looks like Serious Sam, albeit much blurrier. And it plays like Serious Sam, with a bunch of enemies rushing at you, and you needing to pick them off by strafing around them in circles. But unfortunately, the damn enemy hitboxes are so tiny that you have to have surgical accuracy to hit anything. Even the shotgun requires the precision of a sniper rifle. The small hitboxes could have been overlooked had the aiming been tight, but even a single tap on the D-pad sends your crosshairs a meter in either direction. You can hold down the B button for more precise aiming, but then you're locked in one place. Aiming is just not precise enough. And that's a real shame because Serious Sam on the GBA could have been an awesome, faithful rendition of the core Serious Sam gameplay. If this game had had some extra development time to iron out this issue, I imagine it could have been one of the best shooters on the system. But as it is, it's only mid. Okay, so it's a stretch to call Silent Scope on the GBA a 3D GBA game, but it is a fairly accurate port of a 3D game onto the GBA, and so it felt worth including. It's really surprising just how accurate of a port Silent Scope actually is. Besides being able to transition smoothly from location to location, Silent Scope on the GBA is nearly identical to the arcade and PS2 versions of Silent Scope. You really don't lose much in the translation to portable hardware. It even includes the entire second campaign, unlocked after beating the first game. Granted, each campaign is roughly 15 minutes long, if that, so it's a very, very short game. But if you're into high scores and want to see how a 3D arcade classic was ported to the GBA, I definitely recommend giving Silent Scope a shot. I really wish Star Wars Flight of the Falcon had had a bit more time in the oven, because this could have been awesome. Flight of the Falcon is a valiant attempt at bringing a Rogue Squadron type game to the GBA, but it fails in one major regard. The frame rate here is just awful, and it ruins the entire experience. Moving the Millennium Falcon around is imprecise because of the frame rate, as you'll often over or undershoot where you're headed because the game is trying to catch up to your input. Aiming is also ruined, as by the time you get your crosshairs on the enemy position, they'll be somewhere else. Later levels, like the speeder chase through the trees, are a slideshow nightmare. This really sucks because Flight of the Falcon could have been very cool had that frame rate been fixed. Most levels take place in the darkness of space too, so I'm not exactly sure what's causing the game to be taxing enough for the FPS to take a hit like that. But oh well. Flight of the Falcon could be worth checking out as a sort of masochistic what could have been, but for everyone else, steer clear of Flight of the Falcon. Star X is a rather ambitious attempt at SNES-era Star Fox on the GBA. It often feels like a blatant ripoff of Star Fox, actually, which could have been cool if it had been any good. Star Fox X makes a great initial first impression. It looks exactly like Star Fox, complete with big, blocky, polygonal models. The big issue here is that it is just all too much for the GBA to handle. Once a bunch of enemies appear on screen, the frame rate takes a dramatic hit. Enemy projectiles are fired rapidly, and because of the poor frame rate, they're sometimes on screen for no more than 5 or 6 frames. And when things get really hectic, it's all just too much to handle. The crosshairs isn't helpful at all either, as it will whip wildly around as you're trying to line up a shot. I love the idea of Star Fox on the GBA, and it makes sense why the developer decided to invest in Star X. It's just too bad that they didn't iron out the performance and dial in the crosshairs a bit more before launch. Star X is unique on the GBA for its graphical style, but it fits right in with every other middling shooter. Tron 2.0 is yet another 2D game, except instead of 3D sections being sandwiched in between the 2D levels, there's an entire separate 3D mode here, although thankfully they can all be played with bots. The first one is a light cycle racer, but it's in 2D, so I skipped it. The other two are a tank arena battler and a flying ship battler, both of which are in the first-person perspective and play out like your typical multiplayer first-person shooter deathmatch. And they're pretty dang fun. At least the tank one is. The flying one doesn't quite work out so well with the added verticality. Moving up and down to aim your shots is done with a single button, so in order to descend, you have to wait for your ship to drop due to gravity, which makes it difficult to aim in tense shootouts. The tank levels, though, feel like a proper first-person shooter deathmatch, albeit with Tron theming and GBA-style graphics. I played a number of matches, and while it's very simple, there are a number of power-ups to collect, and it can get outright tense, especially when you're fighting multiple opponents at the same time. If you can convince anyone you know to play Tron 2.0 on the GBA together, I imagine it's even better. But even as a single-player shooter using bots, this one is worth checking out. Yet another Blue Rose's engine marvel, Wing Commander Prophecy is a port of the original PC release, compressing absolutely everything besides the full motion videos onto a tiny GBA cart. Prophecy is a space combat game, and a damn good one at that. It's insanely impressive that such a complex 3D game was ported onto such a tiny handheld. There's a meaty story here, and although the full motion video sequences have been cut, they've been replaced with talking heads. It leads to some strange dialogue that feels like it's been left somewhat out of context, but it works to break up the pace of the combat. This game even has Mark Hamill. The combat is fantastic too, with one caveat. It's great once you turn on God mode. Yes, I know that's cheating, but Wing Commander Prophecy is so dang difficult that I couldn't make it past the second mission on my own. I couldn't figure out for the life of me how to avoid being hit with missiles once they had locked on, despite trying to find the answer on the internet, and there's no tutorial to explain the controls either. This game was in desperate need of a tutorial. I imagine the original cartridge came with a manual, which would have likely solved that problem, but in 2024, I had to turn on God mode. It's also built into the game, with a super easy cheat plugged in at the title screen, and it makes the game an absolute blast. Rolling around in space, blasting enemies is really fun, and the Blue Rose's engine does a good job keeping the performance consistent even when there's a bunch of fully 3D enemies on screen. Blue Roses is used to great effect here, but there is a great deal of open space, so it's a more subtle use of 3D than in something like Smashing Drive, which is perhaps why Wing Commander Prophecy runs so well. I had a blast with this game once I had turned the cheats on. It becomes a fun space power fantasy that looks and runs great and has a fairly interesting story to boot. If you're willing to cheat a little, Wing Commander Prophecy is definitely worth checking out. Okay, I understand that I might get a lot of hate for this, but Wolfenstein 3D just isn't a very good game. Look, I appreciate its significance in basically creating the first-person shooter genre, but that doesn't mean that it holds up today in the same way that something like Doom does. Wolfenstein 3D on the GBA is just Wolfenstein 3D. You move around plain-looking rooms, looking for an exit while shooting and stabbing enemies. The levels are extremely similar looking, and their maze-like structure makes it just a pain to navigate. The shooting is also extremely basic. You aim at your target and shoot until it's dead. The GBA rendition is a fine version though. It looks like Wolfenstein 3D and plays like Wolfenstein 3D. It's not a bad game, it just hasn't aged very well. If you're desperate for Wolfenstein 3D on the GBA, this is a perfectly serviceable way to indulge your nostalgia. But if you're looking for a fun first-person shooter on the GBA, there are a lot of better games to try out. Thanks so much for watching. And if there's any games that I missed, please let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.